Salutations, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland. So this video is about mercenaries. These days, they're mercenary companies, often known as private military companies, PMCs, mercenaries, sometimes called PMC contractors, and so on. So mercenaries are nothing new. They go back as far as recorded warfare itself. But so I don't propose to go into the ancient history of mercenaries, but really to look at mercenaries in the modern world, as in since the Second World War. So they were commonplace until the 19th century. They're gradually outlawed, like Switzerland, for example, which provided a lot of them because Switzerland was not a wealthy country, mountainous country, landlocked country, and a way to make a living was going and fighting elsewhere in Italy and in France and so on. But there was an exception there. They allowed recruitment for the Swiss Guard, as in the Pope's private army still exists with those tasteful dress uniforms of confection, which is blue, red, and yellow, designed by Michelangelo. Anyway, most countries have legislation forbidding people from becoming mercenaries. Sometimes they're allowed to join the army of another country. Republic of Ireland, some men from my country would join the British Army, not me, and so on. Or to join a recognised army is usually allowed. People from various Commonwealth countries are allowed to join the British Army, things like that. And there's the French Foreign Legion, but that is properly part of the French Army. It's aimed at people who are not French, been going since the 1830s. Some French people were stripped of their citizenship, had the chance to regain it by serving 5 years there. The Spanish Foreign Legion, despite its name, most of its members were Spanish, are Spanish. So their mercenary activity is regarded as a scourge by some, and it's going on a lot these days in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, various African countries, the Central African Republic, Nigeria, so forth. So modern mercenary activity really came to the fore in the 60s. 1960 was a year when many African countries became independent, and the most prominent country for this mercenary activity was the Congo, the erstwhile Belgian colony. And on the 30th of June 1960, it was granted independence by Belgium. King Baudouin of the Belgians went there and delivered his oration, which now would be regarded as incredibly tactless, what he said, suggesting that Belgian rule had been so good for the Congolese. All right, there have been some civilization advantages, but there'd definitely be terrible things which it didn't allude to at all, as in at least hundreds of thousands of people killed by Leopold II, and horrific exploitation, particularly in the early days. But anyway, I'm not going to tell the whole story of the Congo crisis, but there were civil wars. Katanga, this resource-rich province in the southern part of Congo, seceded, and mercenaries were there helping them. This is largely due to mercenary activity. The Congolese army couldn't deal with the situation because Belgian and French mercenaries, particularly under Bob Denard, were there to help the secessionist movement. Just because the Belgians and the French, they didn't really like the government in Leopoldville, it's now called Kinshasa, didn't like Patrice Lumumba, felt he was too radical, a real African nationalist who was appealing to the Soviet Union for help. Wasn't actually a communist, but perhaps leaned towards it. Anyway, so 5th Commando was there for a while, later on, led by Mike Moore. I blush to mention he's Irish, although born in India. Anyway, so they wreaked havoc in various countries. Anyway, what else am I going to point out? So there was more fighting there till 1964, then it finally calmed down, and the mercenaries gradually left, not all successful. Okay, the mercenaries were sometimes hired by the government, particularly by Mobutu Sese Seko Koko Ngbendu Wazabanga. Joseph Mobutu, as he originally was, sergeant in La Force Publique, as in the army of the Belgian Congo. Later, he made himself president. So they've often caused mayhem across various countries. And the mercenaries fighting in the Congo, eventually there were South African whites almost exclusively, or I think exclusively. They're from West Germany. Remember, that's the days when Germany is divided to East and West. West was pro-American, East was pro-Soviet. They were British, they were whatever, from the United States and other countries. There were Zimbabwean whites. Of course, they would have been called Rhodesian in those days. So what else would I point out? And some of their enemies were bad, were sometimes massacring civilians. But when Congolese people, black people, were massacred, when they were killed by mercenaries, people didn't seem to be terribly bothered by that. Certainly white opinion, the rest of the world wasn't. When white civilians were killed, that was regarded as savage. And I've seen this footage. You should watch this documentary Adio Africa, and it shows some of these mercenaries under Mad Mike Hoare collecting human skulls and having a human skull on their jeep, which was barbaric. Imagine if a black person had said that, what had done that, what would be said? Anyway, so Lumumba, obviously, he's overthrown and killed, and it was with the connivance of the Belgian government that he was actually killed by the Congolese people, because of his very truculent speech. Well, he paid with his life for that. And the CIA was on the side of his enemies, because the United Nations troops were there to try and provide security, try to help the Congolese government find its feet. It was a fledgling democracy. Patrice Lumumba was 35 years old. A journalist, had no political experience, really. He'd been in an assembly for 2 years, an elected assembly, a talking shop, but not been able to control anything. And it was a very fast-moving and challenging situation. It would have taxed the skills of even the most consummate politician, and he had no experience. So yeah, he was a man of extraordinary dignity. You should see the last ever footage of him when he has his hands bound behind his back and he's being pulled roughly by the hair by rebel soldiers who were eventually to kill him. There was a university named after him in Moscow sometime later, Patrice Lumumba University. It's now called Druzhba, as in, People's Friendship University. Anyway, the United Nations had rushed troops to the Congo, Irish soldiers, for example, relative of mine indeed, but they're attacked by insurgents. Some Baluba tribesmen. There was an ambush where 9 Irish soldiers were killed, and these rebels were actually backed by the United States. So come on, America's meant to be friendly towards Ireland. So Jean Schramm was one of the mercenary leaders of the French and Belgian mercenaries. And by the way, the Belgians, they could all speak French. Some of them were Francophone, some of them were not, but still spoke French as a second language. They were known as les affreux, like the frightful ones. And these guys had military experience. Loads of people in the Western world had military experience at that time. It was not that long after the Second World War. Some of them were even veterans of the Second World War. There was Müller, Congo Müller, a West German. He was a veteran of the Wehrmacht, as in the army in the Second World War. But remember, obviously, the compulsory military service in France, Germany, almost every European country. The United Kingdom hadn't quite entered it. Republic of Ireland, we didn't have it after the Second World War. I know we're neutral in the Second World War, but we still had conscription. I know we weren't a republic till 1949, but I'm saying republic because I'm talking about the 26 counties. So a lot of these Frenchmen fighting in the Congo, they'd fought in Algeria. France pulled out of there in 1962. They'd fought against the FLN. And so they were smarting from that defeat there. They wanted to retain white master in Africa. And to be frank, some of them were motivated by straightforward racism as well as filthy lucre. Anyway, when they were pulling out men of Jean Schramm, that's when 5 Commando from Mike Hoare came up. Mike Hoare, although he's born in India, he's Irish, he later moved to, where was it? Later moved to South Africa. We'd been in England for a while in the British Army, then in South Africa as an accountant. A very banal job. What a difference it was to be a mercenary commander. And why would people join as mercenaries? Well, they could make more money that way. To some extent, ideological conviction. It can be both. It doesn't have to be one reason. They don't necessarily contradict each other. Some of them, had experienced, this torsion of their minds in wartime. I suppose might have had verbal tics, facial tics, post-traumatic stress disorder, couldn't readjust to civilian life, missed the camaraderie, the sense of mission of fighting. Some of them, criminals on the run, jailbirds. So a few ex-cons, desperados and cutthroats. So he led his ragtag army, but he did insist on certain military standards, like they had to shave each day, they had to be tidy, and Mad Mike Hoare was always immaculately well turned out. I thought, how on earth did you manage this in the deepest Congo, when often would have been no running water? Sometimes there would have been, but the war came along and the water pipes knocked out. And how did you get your suit pressed and all the rest of it? Barely enough clean water to drink, let alone wash and shave. And always have his beret folded just so, never seemed to be out of position, not a speck of mud on his uniform. So East German radios and the communists, they dubbed Mike Hoare the Mad Jackal, and so the sobriquet stuck, Mad Moore. I watched your video in the annexation of Hawaii. Hello, reality is an illusion. Was it remotely accurate? I told you I didn't know a great thing about this. So Mad Mike Hoare seemed to be a man who was not remotely moved by death, and completely unafraid of death, but wasn't at least perturbed by the deaths of his comrades or indeed his enemies, and freely acknowledged killing unarmed people, said were their court-martials, we're a fast-moving echelon. We wouldn't allow enemy in our rear. So if you capture any enemy soldiers, well, we'll just shoot them dead. I think, oh my goodness, how can you do this with no compunction? And killing your enemies in combat is one thing, but this guy is unarmed. He's not a threat to you. Could he keep him as a prisoner? Could he let him free? I know the argument is then he'll get a gun later and come back and attack us and could kill us. But I'm a bit squeamish. I don't like the death penalty. Ah, great. Thank you so much. I did great. So my fan is saying about my Hawaiian video. So he would just kill people without scruple. Of course, people weren't wearing uniforms. You couldn't really tell who was an insurgent, who was not. He later arrived back in an airport in South Africa, was buttonholed by a journalist. And Mike Moore saying, I don't like communists, I don't like African nationalists, they're animals. We killed thousands of them, I wish we'd killed more. It was an astonishing thing to say. I mean, I know he can't be too queasy if he's going to fight, but still he seemed to be extraordinarily bloodthirsty. A psychopath in a sense, the way just not remotely upset by the deaths of other people. Even seeing the images of these bloated, fly-blown corpses on the screen upsets me, let alone to see it in person or to witness it happening. I know his enemies weren't always righteous. So Mike Hall was to go on to attempt to install a government in the Seychelles in 1980, which would be sympathetic to him. Because in the 70s, the Seychelles, a British colony, became independent. And is it Mancham was the first president, but a few years later, he was overthrown by, I can't remember the bloke's name, another white African, Albert France René, something like that. And Mancham was abroad, I think at a Commonwealth conference when this happened, but he still owns extensive property in the Seychelles. And the deal was this: you don't cause trouble, you can still keep it. But anyway, South Africa had apartheid at the time, that system of legal white privilege. And so the Seychelles, being an African country, member of the Organization of African Unity as it then was lent on by the other African countries. You mustn't allow South African Airways to touch down, because South African Airways was touching down the Seychelles, refueling and flying on to places like Hong Kong. He got to stop that, which made it a great deal more difficult for South African Airways to fly to Asia. And there were other things. So South African Bureau of State Security, that's their secret service. Have you done videos of the difference between Ireland and Northern Ireland? I'll do it later. Well, I might do that. We could do about the partition of Ireland. I could talk for hours about it. I could talk for Ireland, as you could possibly notice. Anyway, so Bureau of State Security, that was South Africa's secret service. They gave the go-ahead to Mike Hall to overthrow the government of the Seychelles, but they stipulated two conditions. Well, the first proviso is no South African citizens must be involved. And second of all, no South African weapons, as in it couldn't be traced back to South Africa if it failed. So, because Hall, I don't know if it's ever a South African citizen, I think not, just resident in South Africa. So white citizens of other countries could easily live there because the apartheid government wanted more whites in, so the whites wouldn't be such a tiny minority. Well, they weren't tiny, they were a 20% minority. And so that was that, but he couldn't recruit a sufficient number of men who were foreign citizens in South Africa. Anyway, so he took quite a lot of South African citizens. I won't tell you the whole story, but some of them went earlier, booked into hotels, posing as tourists. The rest came over as some sort of drinking club, the Ancient Order of Foam Blowers, and they had false bottom suitcases. This is before X-ray machines in airports. They only came in later in the 80s. And it was a tiny country, about 100,000 people, a tiny army. To overthrow the government might be quite quick. I don't know exactly what the plan would involve, but ideally you would kill the president. Don't leave him alive. He could escape, he could be rescued, even if you're a prisoner, and there's still hope that he could come back. And then kill the president, seize the telephone exchange, no satellite phones in those days, cut the wires, nobody else can communicate, you presumably have radios, seize the radio station, they had no television station, broadcast your propaganda, we have won, bring your candidate back for the presidency. You seize the airport as well, so that nobody else can get in or out, and you can escape if things go wrong. But anyway, they didn't get that far with their plan, and in the airport, one of their number got in the goods to declare queue by accident, and one of the customs officers was too vigilant and discovered a gun hidden in the bag, so a firefight broke out. Anyway, eventually Mike Hoare and his men were able to hijack an Air India plane and fly on to Durban, where they gave themselves up. Spent only a few years in prison for the hijacking. But so that was that. I don't think anyone got killed in that. I like that President Obama spoke in Ireland outside. I think Bill Clinton spoke in Ireland also during his time as president. Clinton was there a few times. Who was the old Etonian friend of Mark Thatcher to try to overthrow the government of that oil-rich Central African state 20 years ago? So that is Simon Mann. Simon Mann, born 1952 in London. He lived on Chester Square in London, the same square where Margaret Thatcher lived. Simon Mann, that house was inhabited by Matthew Arnold, the famous poet who wrote Thyrsis and so on. Anyway, so Simon Mann, his father was the English cricket captain, went on a tour to South Africa in 1949, met a South African lady, they fell in love, they got married, and that woman's obviously Simon Mann's mother. So South African on his mother's side. His family has a gin fortune or something like that. So Simon Mann went to Eton, wasn't a very academic type. Was he going to pass his O-levels? He did. He went on to Sandhurst, that's the Royal Military Academy, to train as an army officer. It was a 2-year course in those days. Now it's only a 1-year course. He was the last batch to go through the 2-year course, and he got the Soviet Studies Prize, so presumably he can speak a bit of Russian. So he's commissioned to the Scots Guards. You're looking at Buckingham Palace. Those soldiers stomping around outside Buckingham Palace in the red tunics, they're the Foot Guards. They're 5 regiments of Foot Guards. In order of foundation, they're Coldstream Guards, Scots Guards, Grenadier Guards, Irish Guards, and Welsh Guards, all wearing the red or scarlet tunics and the black bearskin hats. The officers have gold collars, gold epaulets, and so on. Well, he's an officer, obviously. So he's not Scottish, but you can still be in the Scots Guards. Never call them Scottish Guards, Scots Guards. And they don't just do ceremonial duties, they do actual fighting. And I think he was in the SAS later. So he was in the Scots Guards for easily 10 years. And he'd only been in for a year. When he was 21, he tried to resign. I thought he could go off and be a mercenary. He's offered to take part in a putsch somewhere in Africa, but he was told he couldn't. The commander of the Scots Guards was nicknamed King at that time, as in related to the King of Scots, a foul, farting little scary guy. And when he went together in a suit to try and resign, Simon Mann, and is the man saying, "What's this nonsense about you trying to resign? You can't." Well, fuck off. He was swearing at Simon Mann, but I want to. And his commander still carries on swearing at him, saying, "I've learned a lot by your channel. The American TV stations are propaganda, both left and right in the political spectrum. You speak the facts. That's what I like." Thank you so much. Well, encourage people to subscribe. And I also rely on donations to sustain the channel. Well, what's the other thing is I teach people online. Any students with me, that's wonderful. Teach them all the humanities subjects, including French. Prepare people for interviews, improve their public speaking, things like that. I'm a tour guide in London, so get people to hire me. So back to Simon Mann. Anyway, he left about 1990, recalled to the colours to fight in the Gulf War in 91, and left again. Read his book, Cry Havoc. So then there was a plot hatched to overthrow the president of Equatorial Guinea, a tiny former Spanish colony, an oil-rich country on the west coast of Africa. And Sir Mark Thatcher, that's Margaret Thatcher's son, was living in South Africa at that time with his American wife, their 2 children. He provided some of the finance for helicopters. And so the Koosters were going to fly to Zimbabwe, change plane, and fly on to Equatorial Guinea. They had their candidate be president, an exiled opposition leader, and they had conversations with Eli Khalil, this Lebanese-British guy, financier, living in London, who was going to financially back it. Eli Khalil died just last summer. I think June last year, fell down the stairs at his house or something. It was quite old. It's not a suspicious death. Eli Khalil, a very reclusive multimillionaire, though his daughter is on Facebook. Anyway, so what about Simon Mann? It's unseasonably warm there. The season got to 26 degrees here. Well, it's fairly warm where I am, but I'm not in the UK. I'm at an undisclosed location. So what's the next thing about Simon Mann? He had fought in Angola in the 1990s for the Angolan government, been commissioned into their army. Okay, so back to the Equatorial Guinea plot. Well, Simon Mann had been in Northern Ireland during the conflict in the 70s, and he said there's a certain a tactic we learned from the Provisional IRA. The weapons and the men come together at the last possible moment and for as short a time as possible, because the IRA would do this, they're going to kill someone, so the trigger man, you go along unarmed, you have somebody, possibly a woman or a child, because they're less likely to be suspected or searched, hand you the gun, shoot the person, hand it back to that woman, and then run. So the thing is, the strongest evidence against you is if you're caught with a weapon in your hand, okay? That's that, because if you're arrested on the way to Equatorial Guinea, if you don't have a weapon, you might not be guilty. But anyway, I don't know how the weapons are going to be smuggled in, but the CIO, Central Intelligence Organization, is the intelligence service of Zimbabwe. They caught wind of the whole plot. So Mann landed in Zimbabwe, arrested, and was beaten up, given a hard time. Torture might be too strong a word. Convicted of various offences and sentenced to all the long-term in prison in Zimbabwe, but managed to keep his spirits up. He was filmed coming in and out of court, but always looked cheerful. He said this plot would either make him a millionaire or get him killed. Have you done a video of Churchill? Good question. I have done some, like outside of one of his London houses. Yeah, and they even did the house he died in London, but I could do more. I prefer to do them on location. So that was the Simon Mann plot. and some of the other guys were arrested, some people in Equatorial Guinea. After a few years, he's finally extradited to Equatorial Guinea, where he faced the death penalty. But anyway, he was given a lesser sentence, was at 34 years, and several years in Black Sands prison. He was released. He gave an interview with Channel 4 News. He decided to sing like a canary, his best way to get out of it. Eli Khalil denied the least bit of involvement, said, "I feel terribly sorry for Mr. Mann, but I haven't met him for years. I don't know the first thing about it." He managed to successfully disclaim responsibility, and there was no proof positive against him. So after several years, Simon Mann was set free. He was arrested in 2004 in Zimbabwe, released in Equatorial Guinea about 8 years later. So got off quite lightly considering, and because he said he was a vicious tyrant, that president of Equatorial Guinea, and will overthrow him. Is it Nguesa is his surname? I can't remember. And then we'll share the oil wealth amongst the people. But he also wanted a very handsome remuneration, Simon Mann. He did say about Angola, one time he was asked to go around and meet some people in London, some other British guys. He did go around for a drink. Okay, he didn't know these people. Why do they want to speak to me? And then they say to Simon Mann and his associate Tony Buckingham, you know, you guys are fighting in Angola for the government. How much would it cost for you not to fight? Saying, what? We'll pay you not to fight. And Simon Mann and his friends say, well, no amount, we're leaving. And they leave with their drinks unfinished because they offended their sense of honor. But if that thought, well, we're some mercenaries. You're supposed to be mercenary, as in driven by money. I thought, well, maybe that was a big mistake, because with mercenaries, you want to stop them, you either buy them out or you take them out. Because we refuse money, we can get ourselves killed. I thought, well, Simon Mann, if I really want to gain, if they're going to pay me not to risk myself, that's an awful lot of a better proposition than paying me to risk myself getting killed. But anyway, he carried on fighting. But I was going to come on to this. So after the Congo, Che Guevara was there fighting, and Mike Moore was there, sometimes fighting for the government. And other big mercenary conflicts. Well, Portuguese rule in Africa was terminated in 1975. Angola, the MPLA, one of the communist guerrilla movements, became the government of Angola. And then there was UNITA, which was also a communist government led by Dr. Jonas Savimbi. Savimbi claimed to be a Maoist, then meant to be supposedly ultra-conservative. So the United States and South Africa, they didn't like MPLA being there, Soviet-backed. So no sooner had Angola become independent and the civil war broke out again, UNITA against the MPLA. Have you done a video on the Russian Tsars? Well, I have a little bit. Look at the ones I did when I was in Moscow. UNITA was backed by South Africa and the United States. CI was there, and South Africa had apartheid. So the obvious thing to throw at UNITA is, how on earth can you be allies of these white supremacists in South Africa? And Jonas Savimbi, you're supposed to be a Maoist. You're supposed to be against racism and all that. And so the Cuban troops were rushed to Angola and fought on the side of the MPLA government. And so the South African army was there in large numbers. Then there were mercenaries, British mercenaries in particular. Famously, there were some Cypriot guys who'd been in the British Army in the parachute regiment who were over there. Some of them were captured. They put on trial in Luanda, the capital of Angola, and some of them were executed by firing squad. There was Colonel Costas, whatever. He wasn't actually a colonel. He'd styled himself colonel. And some of these British guys had gone out and had no military experience whatsoever. And then some people went to fight in Zimbabwe. It was in Rhodesia in the late 70s for the white minority government. But were they mercenaries? Arguably. Some of them were French, previously fought in Algeria, fought in the Congo, and so on. And when I say Congo, I'm talking about the former Belgian Congo, Congo-Kinshasa, not Congo-Brazzaville. Congo-Brazzaville being the former French colony. So we now have to say the Democratic Republic of Congo for the former Belgian Congo, DRC, as opposed to the Republic of Congo, which is Congo-Brazzaville. Because the two Congos, there's the River Congo, there's that basin, and both countries take Congo as their name. So we sometimes, to distinguish them, use the capital as part of the name. Congo-Brazzaville, the former French one, Congo-Kinshasa, the former Belgian one. Oh yeah, I'm asking you. The thing is, in about 1970, Mobutu, who was the president of Congo-Kinshasa, renamed the country Zaire, and the river Zaire, and the currency Zaire. Then he was overthrown, fled in 1998 to Morocco, died of cancer there. But the country then returned to its original name, Congo. Confusing, I know. Okay, so anything else about mercenaries in the modern world that I didn't mention? Yeah, the Soldier of Fortune magazine. The Soldier of Fortune obviously is a nickname for these guns for hire. And the United States Soldier of Fortune magazine used to advertise jobs for mercenaries abroad because a lot of ex-military personnel out of work. And especially after, well, they slimmed down the US military in the late 70s. What about Wagner? Well, there's a Russian private military company called Wagner. Now, being a mercenary is illegal in the Russian Federation, and people say it doesn't exist. So these ex-military guys, they join, they go to their training camps, their mobile phone taken off of them, no internet access, do their training. Only when they come and they'll go off on a mission. A lot of them in various African countries, for example, the Central African Republic. Give a modern example of mercenaries. I'm giving these examples right now. But some people say, well, they're not mercenaries. Others say it's really just the Russian army in a different guise, as in the whole thing is plausible deniability. Oh, it's something to do with us, and they come back and they do whatever. And they go to Syria, and they fight on the side of the Syrian government and so forth. They're in Sudan. Now, I know Putin says he's against Islamic extremism, but there he is propping up one of the most Islamic extremist governments in the world, the Sudanese government. And the Central African Republic, their civil war is partly Muslim versus Christian. There were some latest examples: ISIS, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and obviously they're mercenaries fighting against them. They're private military contractors in all these groups. Are there mercenaries on their side? Not so far as I know. There are some ideological recruits, because ISIS, obviously not a national movement, is for the Ummah, is the worldwide Muslim community. If you're a Sunni extremist, many Sunnis would be against them. Moderate Sunnis would be killed by them. Likewise, the Taliban, likewise Al-Qaeda, because they're a sort of a transnational movement for that particular worldview. So Soldier of Fortune magazine, I don't think they're allowed to still advertise for mercenaries. I'm not sure the magazine even exists, actually. But are these criminal activities they were advertising for? Why was Soldier of Fortune magazine tolerated? Presumably, they had a more than sympathetic relationship with the CIA, with the FBI, National Security Agency, Homeland Security, the US military, and so on. So, anyway, what else did I say? So I talked about the Angolan conflict. I talked about Sir Mark Thatcher, and he pleaded guilty in South Africa to helping to finance this coup, some of these helicopters, and he got some sort of suspended jail term. He was very lucky to get off so lightly. He was deported from South Africa. He's not allowed to live in the United States now, despite having been married to an American citizen. Then they got divorced because of his criminal record. He can't live in the US. He is Sir Mark Thatcher because his father was a captain of industry, an oil executive, was knighted Sir Dennis Thatcher, and when he died, Mark inherited it. Russia is doing nothing. I see that comment just popped up. So wars are never pleasant, but when you're outside the Geneva Convention, if you don't feel bound by those as a PMC, you're going to behave worse. The breakup of the Yugoslavia in the 1990s, a lot of mercenaries fighting at that side, particularly British mercenaries on the Croat side, and so on. There were some Russian soldiers who were out of work fighting for the Serbian side. Partly ideological motivation there, felt that the Serbs are closer to them, Orthodox Christians as well. What's what? Okay, so thing is, PMCs, they don't have a clear chain of command. They're not always wearing a uniform. And if something goes wrong, if they deliberately kill civilians, are they held to account? Probably not. Can escape, can't be traced, and so they're unlikely to be held responsible. And PMCs have been involved in Papua New Guinea in recent years, the Rwanda and Sierra Leone in the late 90s, Sandline, some British mercenaries, South African mercenaries, and so on. Was it Tim Spicer, former commander of the Scots Guards? He was there, having been with the British Army in ex-Yugoslavia just a couple of years earlier. So sometimes governments find them very helpful. Some of them in Nigeria fighting against Boko Haram right now. Russia is only protecting Arab oil, as in Syria. Well, I don't think Syria has a great deal of oil. They're fighting on the side of the Syrian government. I know the Syrian government is horrific, but ISIS is even worse. So sometimes mercenaries are hired by governments, which doesn't guarantee everything that they do is legal and moral. So the Geneva Convention states that mercenaries are not soldiers, and mercenaries, if captured, don't have to be accorded the same rights that are accorded to soldiers. So being a mercenary is usually a crime. So that's that. You could be prosecuted for that on its own. So are their killings unlawful? I would say so. And they're premeditated. Wouldn't that make them murder? Anyway, so in America's adventures in the Middle East over the past 20 years, they've used a great number of mercenaries, an increasing number of mercenaries. They call themselves private military companies, and they say, oh, well, we only provide logistical support, and that's true. They even have people who cook food for soldiers and provide training and all the rest of it. But some of them do actual fighting as well, where we're security guards. Okay, but you have a military-grade weapon. We only defend. Well, you see, the distinction between defense and attack is not always real. And if you know the enemy's coming to attack you, some people will say, well, let's go and actually get the enemy before they kill us. Some people will say the best form of defense is attack. US has destroyed everything, and the intel agency is now operating terrorist mafia. Well, I don't quite agree, but that's such a can of worms, that comment. I'm not going to get into it because I would be here all day. Thoughts on who'll be the Democratic nominee to go against Trump? Well, again, that's an issue for another video. I was thinking Joe Biden, but there's so many missteps by him. Probably Elizabeth Warren, who would be her running mate. She might pick anyone, someone not heard of. Maybe Pete Buttigieg would be a good idea. Youth and experience balanced. I think it'd be good to have at least one woman, or at least one ethnic minority person. Previously, I thought that the dream ticket would be Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. But anyway, so Blackwater is a famous PMC. Eric Prince helped found it, and he said PMCs are as American as apple pies. He found out the colonies, when America was founded as English colonies, were set up by PMCs. But okay, times have changed. Mercenaries is not allowed to exist anymore. Isn't PMC just a euphemism for mercenary? So they're operating to this day in Syria, off the coast of Somalia, on anti-piracy operations, and in Yemen. Din Corp is another major one. So former US military personnel often join them. The US government often hires them, but only a minority of the PMCs working for the United States are made up of most of the American citizens. So there is some US military officers in Iraq complain that PMCs can kill civilians willy-nilly, obviously cause a terrible problem, not least for those who get killed, but really bad press for the United States, and then the US military has to clean up the mess. Don't have the same rules of engagement, not as disciplined. So you're a soldier, you want to leave the army, and don't have some of the bothersome discipline, don't have to worry about the uniform so much, and can still do soldiering and get a lot more money. I think you are throw military. I can't read the last word. I'm not a military person at all, by the way. I've never been a soldier for a single day. So PMCs, they do provide security, but they definitely fight. Anyway, so governments find them more cost effective because yes, their cost per diem is a lot higher, but you only have to hire them for a limited period. You don't have to recruit them or train them and all the rest of it. When you don't need them for combat, you don't have to pay them anymore. The soldier might go through a 5-year military career, not fight for a single day. You don't have any duty of care, any pension, any medical care costs afterwards, and you can put them in the most dangerous place. They can get killed. The public doesn't care. They don't count as soldiers. They're often not citizens of your country. They don't have relatives or anxious or ask them to be brought home. So that's why it can actually be more cost effective. And you can say, well, we're just putting you into a dangerous position. It doesn't matter if they all get killed. So they're very handsomely paid. They don't show up in the casualty lists. So conventional armies often find it more difficult to recruit. I suppose children grow up without so much sport, without so much discipline, and they don't want to undergo the burdensome duties of soldiering. And the other problem is also retention. So people sign up for a few years in an army, and then they choose to leave because they can get paid an awful lot more as a mercenary, and they can have the actual adventure of fighting. Because some soldiers I know, to my astonishment, wanted to fight, saying, "We've trained for it, let's do it." It's the ultimate experience. You're not much of a soldier if you're eager not to fight. So that's why talented and accomplished soldiers are more likely to join PMCs. And so keeping people in a conventional military force is more difficult. So that's why conventional military forces find it difficult to fight, even if they want to, because they're lacking as many experienced people and gifted soldiers and all the rest of it that they used to have. 30 years ago, wouldn't have had this problem in the major Western armies. So does it matter that they're PMCs? Because, if a soldier kills an enemy or a PMC contractor kills an enemy, what difference does it make? The outcome is the same, right? Well, you could argue that, but soldiers are supposed to be disciplined. I know PMCs have usually been through military training. You could take a complete greenhorn like me and try to train me up to be one. I wouldn't have what it takes. I don't have the sound what it takes. I don't have the physical fitness. Certainly don't have the inclination. But PMCs, they perhaps don't have such a clear chain of command. They're more likely to disappear. And some of them come from very undeveloped countries and get paid less because of that, coming from countries like the Philippines, Nicaragua, Honduras, and so on. Does that mean that their work isn't as good? I don't think so. I don't know. So a war zone is a legal no man's land at the best of times. But the rise of the PMC has made the situation even more intractable than it was heretofore. So PMC contractors are seldom, if ever, brought to book for war crimes. So it also reduces governmental control, reduces civilian control of the military. There's less public accountability of what's going on. The public is in the dark. Who are these PMCs? Who's the beneficial owner? Where are the profits going? And you can see there's a perverse incentive to maintain war forever. We already have problems with the military-industrial complex in various countries, the war industry, who are eagerly lobbying for these forever wars, who've got their pet journalists feeding them their stories to publish, have a sewer of choice, a particular media outlet through which to pump out pro-war propaganda. So they can be evangelizing for the cause of militarism, but the PMCs, because they're making such a buck off it, the worst possible thing for them would be an outbreak of peace. So they want to avoid peace at all costs. They'll do whatever it takes. Wars become impossible to halt. Trump would never have been president. The Democrats had a different nominee. Hillary is unliked as Trump. Well, the other likely frontrunner for that was Bernie Sanders. I know this is the idea that you should feel the burn, that Bernie would have won. I don't subscribe to that view myself. I thought it was too left field. Bear in mind that Hillary Clinton did actually win the popular vote by 3 million votes and 2 percentage points. I think Bernie would have been savaged for being too far from the mainstream, even though I concur with some of his ideas. The counter-argument is he would have motivated some disenfranchised people, some millennials, some minority people like African Americans who were disenchanted, felt that Hillary Clinton just offered more of the same, wasn't going to do enough for them. Bernie Sanders would have issued a formal apology for slavery. He would have said, well, let's do something about reparations for the descendants of the victims who still feel the repercussions of slavery to this day, who still suffer from the consequences of the segregation era, which only ended 50 years ago. Okay, so back to the subject about PMCs. So they have a vested interest in perpetuating war, and you can have a PMC hired by both sides in a conflict. Keep it going. We're going to create the problem and solve the problem. Well, let's never solve it, let's just escalate it. We don't really know who the actors are. They may have some sort of hidden agenda and be hired by another government without your knowing it. So my thoughts on Bernie Sanders' plan for free tuition. Oh my goodness, that's a whole other video. I think it's probably a bit too much. I think it's over generous. But get me to make another video about it because it's not really part of the subject. Anyway, so how is a PMC different from a terrorist organization? Well, I suppose they're hired by governments, and what counts as a terrorist is also another debatable issue. There is no easy answer. PMCs, they might be better, they might be ethical. Perhaps they're not all bad people who work for them. You know, I've met at least one mercenary in my life, but that's that. So we're seeing the increasingly privatization of war, just like we have of defense procurement, everything like that. So I think it's a dangerous step. And I don't see it being put into reverse. So we're just going to see more and more of it. They don't want peace because then they'd be out of a job. So what's next for PMC? Some sort of international regulation convention to get rid of them. Probably not going to happen, not be effectively enforced because there's so many advantages in using PMCs. Where's the next conflict? Is the Afghanistan one coming to an end? Looks like it's calming down, but they're going to flare up elsewhere. All right, those are my uncollected and disparate thoughts on PMCs. Please subscribe to me on YouTube, donate on Patreon, see me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram.